Camping alone in the wilderness was my way of disconnecting from the chaos of city life. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Just me, my tent, and the forest. I had chosen a remote spot in a national park, known for its serene trails and quiet beauty. Little did I know that weekend would change the way I saw the woods forever. I arrived at the trailhead early on a crisp Friday morning. The drive had been long, but the sight of towering trees and the smell of fresh pine made it worthwhile. I hiked for hours, finding the perfect spot by a crystal-clear stream. It was secluded, just the way I liked it. By late afternoon, my tent was up, and I was ready to relax. The first night started uneventfully. I cooked a simple meal over a small fire, sipped hot tea, and watched the stars. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature, crickets chirping, an occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. But around midnight, the noises changed. I was lying in my tent, half asleep, when I heard what sounded like faint footsteps circling my campsite. At first, I dismissed it as an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. But the steps were too heavy, too deliberate. They stopped and started, as if someone was pausing to observe. My heart began to race. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly, shining the beam into the trees. Nothing. Just the dense, dark forest staring back at me. I told myself it was my imagination and tried to sleep, but the unease lingered. The next day, I brushed it off and decided to explore the area. I hiked deeper into the forest, taking photos of the breathtaking scenery. By late afternoon, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop. A makeshift campsite, long abandoned. The tent was shredded, its fabric tangled in the bushes. Rusted utensils and a torn sleeping bag were scattered around. But the most chilling thing was the carvings on the nearby tree. Leave. The word was gouged deep into the bark, repeated several times. It felt like a warning, one I foolishly ignored. I returned to my own campsite, shaken but determined not to let fear ruin my trip. By the time night fell, I was on edge. I kept my fire going longer than usual, its crackling flames my only comfort. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time they were closer, more deliberate. My tent felt like a fragile barrier against whatever was out there. I didn't dare make a sound, hoping whoever or whatever it was would go away. Then came the snapping of twigs, so close it felt like it was just outside my tent. Summoning courage, I whispered, "Who's there?" No response, just silence, and then the sound of something being dragged through the underbrush. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give me away. I clutched my hunting knife, every muscle in my body tense. Minutes felt like hours before the noises faded. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave. As I packed, I noticed something that froze me in place. Footprints. Human footprints, circling my tent, deeply embedded in the soil. They weren't there the day before. Whoever it was had been close, watching me. The hike back to my car was nerve-wracking. Every sound made me jump. About halfway back, I realized I wasn't alone. Through the trees, I caught glimpses of movement, shadows darting between the trunks. My pace quickened, but the presence kept following me, always just out of sight. I didn't stop until I reached my car. As I threw my gear into the back seat, I turned for one last look at the trailhead. That's when I saw him, a man standing just inside the tree line. He was wearing dirty, tattered clothes, and his face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me, unblinking. He didn't move, didn't say a word. I slammed the door, started the engine, and sped off, my hands shaking on the wheel. Even hours later, back in the safety of my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I never reported the incident. What would I say? That a man followed me in the woods, that I found a creepy campsite. It didn't seem like enough. But I haven't been camping alone since. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I see that figure in the woods, standing perfectly still, waiting, and I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did? I've always prided myself on being an experienced camper. The woods, with their endless mystery and tranquility, were my retreat from a world that often felt too loud and overwhelming. This time I decided to head to a lesser-known forest reserve deep in the mountains. It was remote, untouched by civilization, and exactly what I needed. Or so I thought. I arrived late in the afternoon, parked my car at the trailhead, and hiked about 5 miles into the forest. The trail was rugged, the kind that hadn't seen much foot traffic in years. After an hour of climbing, I found a flat spot nestled between tall pines. It was isolated, the kind of place where the silence was almost suffocating. Perfect. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I had my tent set up and a small fire crackling. The first night passed uneventfully, just the usual sounds of the forest, like rustling leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, calming even. Little did I know, it was the calm before the storm. The trouble started on the second night. I spent the day exploring nearby trails and taking photos of the stunning scenery. As I returned to my campsite, I noticed something odd. A small pile of sticks, arranged in a neat triangle near my tent. I didn't remember seeing it that morning. Assuming it was nothing, I kicked the sticks away and went about my evening routine. Night fell, and with it came an unsettling feeling of being watched. As I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd hear a faint rustle in the distance, followed by silence. I told myself it was just the wind or an animal, but my nerves were on edge. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I extinguished the fire, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching on the forest floor just outside my tent. My eyes shot open, and my heart began to race. I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps stopped, then started again, circling my tent. My mind raced. Could it be another camper? A ranger? But why wouldn't they announce themselves? I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my fingers trembling. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely steady. Silence. I unzipped the tent slowly, shining the flashlight into the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but shadows. The footsteps had stopped. My mind screamed at me to pack up and leave. But it was the middle of the night, and the thought of hiking back to my car in the dark was equally terrifying. I crawled back into my tent and sat there, knife in hand, waiting for the first light of dawn. Sleep was impossible. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my heart jump, but nothing happened. The next morning I stepped out of my tent, exhausted but relieved to see the sun. My relief was short-lived. On the ground, right where I'd heard the footsteps, were deep boot prints. They circled my tent several times before disappearing into the trees. I told myself it was probably a hunter or a hiker who hadn't meant any harm. But deep down, I knew something was off. Determined to finish the trip, I packed up and moved to another site about a mile away. The second night, was worse. I had just started to relax when I heard it again, those same deliberate footsteps. This time they didn't stop at circling the tent. They approached it. Slowly, deliberately, the steps came closer and closer until they were right outside. My flashlight was in my hand before I realized I was holding my breath. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but the footsteps stopped. Then, something scratched the side of my tent, lightly at first, then harder, like someone dragging a stick or a knife along the fabric. I yelled, "Whoever's out there, leave now. I'm armed." My voice cracked, betraying my fear. Silence. And then, retreating footsteps. I didn't wait for sunrise this time. I threw my gear into my backpack, collapsed the tent in record time, and started hiking back to the car. Every shadow felt alive, every sound a threat. By the time I reached the trailhead, my legs were jelly and my lungs burned. But I didn't stop until I was inside my car, the doors locked, and the engine running. As I drove away, my headlights caught something in the rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the trail was a figure, tall and motionless, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew one thing. They weren't wearing the kind of clothes you'd expect in the wilderness. To this day, I don't know who or what followed me in those woods, but I haven't gone camping since, and I never will. Camping was my escape. The humdrum of everyday life in the city drained me, and nothing recharged my soul like a weekend in the woods. This time, I decided to camp in a remote area of a national forest I had read about online. It wasn't an official campground, but that was the appeal. Untouched wilderness, no other campers, just me and nature. I parked my car at the end of a dirt road and hiked several miles into the forest. The trail was overgrown, the trees thick, and the air cool and damp. It felt like the kind of place no one had been in a long time. By late afternoon, I found a spot near a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and settled in for a quiet evening. The first night was uneventful. The fire crackled, and the stars glimmered through the canopy above. The sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant animal calls lulled me into a sense of calm. But that calm shattered when I woke up abruptly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why I woke up. Everything was silent. Too silent. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, even the rustle of leaves, were gone. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. I lay there, listening, when I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from the trees behind my tent. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The steps didn't sound like an animal. They were heavy, uneven, like someone trying to move quietly but failing. My heart pounded as I reached for my flashlight. Summoning every ounce of courage, I unzipped the tent and shone the light into the trees. Nothing. I scanned the woods, the beam cutting through the darkness, but I saw no one. The footsteps had stopped. I stood there for a few minutes, the flashlight trembling in my hand, before convincing myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. I crawled back into the tent, though sleep didn't come easily. The next day, I found something strange near my campsite. About 20 yards into the woods, there was a small pile of rocks stacked in a neat little tower. It hadn't been there the day before. I knelt down to examine it, unease creeping up my spine. Was it some kind of marker? A joke? I shook it off as coincidence and decided to move my campsite further down the trail, just in case. By late afternoon, I had set up in a new spot, deeper in the woods. This area felt less ominous, or so I told myself. I spent the evening trying to relax, but the events of the previous night lingered in my mind. When darkness fell, I kept the fire burning high and stayed awake as long as I could. The second night was worse. I was jolted awake around 2 a.m. by a loud snap, like a branch breaking underfoot. This time it wasn't just footsteps. It sounded like something circling my campsite. Whatever it was moved erratically, stopping and starting, weaving through the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my mind racing. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. Then from the darkness came the sound of breathing, deep, ragged breaths. I shone the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam revealed nothing. My heart was racing so hard it hurt. The breathing stopped, replaced by the sound of retreating footsteps. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I was ready to leave. As I packed up, I felt like I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me whip around, but I saw nothing. I hurriedly packed my gear and began the hike back to my car. The final stretch of the trail was the most unnerving. I kept hearing faint whispers, so soft I couldn't make out the words, like the forest itself was murmuring. Then I saw it, a figure standing far down the trail. At first I thought it was another hiker, but something about the way they stood, motionless, almost too still, made my stomach churn. I called out, "Hello?" No response. The figure didn't move. I backed away slowly, my instincts screaming at me to leave. When I glanced back a few seconds later, the figure was gone. I didn't stop until I reached my car. As I threw my gear into the back seat and started the engine, I felt a wave of relief. But as I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the road, partially hidden by the trees, was a person. Their face was obscured, but I could feel their eyes on me, unblinking. I floored the gas, my hands gripping the wheel. To this day, I have no idea who or what was out there. But I've never gone camping alone again, and I never will.